Hello everyone. For the next couple of weeks, we'll be focusing on the intersection of art and politics in Latin America, or how art and politics have influenced one another. The engagement of artists with the political world around them has been particularly strong in Latin America, and their style has had a profound influence on artists around the world. Let's first look at the Mexican Muralist movement, whose style of publicly oriented and politically engaged art was really unique in the world at the time and had influence far beyond its national borders. This painting is one example, a piece called The March of Humanity by David Alfaro Siqueiros, painted in 1971. The chairs in the lower left of the photo revealed the size of this work. The enormity of these murals was characteristic of the group. The piece includes mural painting and painted polyform sculpture. The themes represent the Mexican nation as dynamic, progressive, proud of its heritage, and also forward-looking. The Mexican Muralist movement emerged in the wake of the Mexican Revolution, which spanned the period of 1910 to 1921. The Mexican Revolution, which was a complex, ever-shifting struggle involving several armies pursuing different goals, was nevertheless united in its opposition to President Porfirio Diaz, pictured here. Diaz had ruled Mexico from 1876 to 1911 in dictatorial fashion, leveraging policies to promote an export-oriented plantation economy. Through legal and illegal means, large landowners pushed peasant farmers off their lands, thereby accumulating large land holdings and essentially obliging landless peasants to become wage laborers working in exploitative conditions. At the end of the revolution, the new government that emerged, called the Institutional Revolutionary Party, had the goal of promoting national unity. It did so by promoting the notion that Mexico was a mestizo, mixed Indian and Hispanic, nation, and by promising social equality. The new Minister of Education had an idea that this national unity could be cultivated through the public display of political art. The minister commissioned artists to paint murals in public places, murals that would instill a love of the nation defined as mestizo, unified, and equal. 3 of these muralists are particularly well known, and we'll look at some examples of their work. The first of the Mexican muralists was José Clemente Orozco. I've been able to see many of his works in person, and he's probably my favorite of the group because of the passion conveyed in his work. This is Orozco's portrait of Father Miguel Hidalgo. It is an enormous mural painted on the ceiling of the grand staircase of City Hall in Guadalajara. You can see the banisters around the sides. As you ascend the staircase, you look up, and there is this enormous image of the priest above you. And that gives you a sense of how overpowering this image is. Father Miguel Hidalgo was a leader of Mexico's strike for independence from Spain. He led the famous Kray for independence on September 16, 1810, and September 16th is celebrated every year as Mexico's Independence Day. Another of Orozco's famous works was actually painted at Dartmouth College in the basement reading room of the library in a narrative circle on the walls. This work, called The Epic of American Civilization, contains several panels, each representing a different epoch in American history. When I worked at Dartmouth, my office was in this building, and I would love to sit in this reading room and take in these images. I want to show you a few of these panels. The first is of the pre-Columbian Golden Age, in which we see a common theme of the Mexican muralists, which was pride in the ancient indigenous civilizations in an attempt to recuperate their memory or to push back against the scorn that had been directed at the pre-Hispanic civilizations during the colonial period. This panel shows the indigenous people as working in harmony with nature and also industrious and strong. Note the heating grate in the top center, which reminds you that this is in a library. This panel also represents the pre-Columbian Golden Age and shows ancient Mexican gods, including Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, here represented in the time when he was still a man on earth, and according to myth, with his lighter skin and beard. In this panel, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, departs from the world of men, heading east, from which he would return once again, according to the prophecy. This panel depicts the practice of Aztec human sacrifices to the gods, in which the heart was extracted and offered up to sustain Quetzalcoatl and others. This panel shows the arrival of Hernán Cortés in Mexico, carrying his sword, accompanied by the friar with his cross. You can see the door into the hallway on the bottom left. This panel represents the period of the Revolution. To the left are the wealthy, allied with the army, hoarding the nation's riches. In the center, rising above them, is one hero of the Revolution, Emiliano Zapata, who fought for land redistribution under the slogan Land and Liberty. The buildings in the background represent the promise of industrial progress. This next panel demonstrates the strength and power of industrial progress, but its overpowering nature also hints that technology had the potential to crush the soul of workers. In this panel, Orozco warns against the gods of the modern world, or science, the skeletons of the educators, of the woman, and the skeletal babies in jars suggest that adoration of science has the potential to kill the soul of humanity. The robes of the educators in the background point to Orozco's audience. The crimson robes are of Harvard, the blue ones are Yale, suggesting that Orozco wants to warn those at the Ivy League schools, Dartmouth included, that they should not forget the soul of humanity. The second most famous of the Mexican muralists was David Alfaro Siqueiros. His biography reveals the political context of his work, and as we will see, many of the events that shaped his life and work were shared by other artists of this time. Siqueiros was a soldier who fought in the Mexican Revolutionary Army. After that, he was commissioned by the new government to paint murals to reach the Mexican people. His commitment to equality and social justice then led him to volunteer to fight in the Spanish Republican Army against the fascist forces. Many of his paintings warned about the rise of and the evils of fascism. Having studied painting in Europe, he was very influenced by Expressionism and Futurism, but he adapted these styles to reflect a Mexican sensibility. He was also an innovator, using quick-drying industrial paint, spray paint on cement, both reflecting his faith in industrial progress, and he combined sculpture and painting in many of his works. His murals were also massive, and this image is just one detail from a much larger piece which documented the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz and the revolution that fought against it. This image is once again a detail from a much larger mural. This mural conveys the government's promise that a centralized industrial development initiative would harness industry for the good of the nation, lifting people out of poverty while giving them dignity and ensuring their safety. This final mural, painted by Siqueiros at Mexico's National Autonomous University, suggests that the national government supports the public by providing affordable education. Probably the most famous artist of the Mexican muralist movement is Diego Rivera. Rivera's work most clearly displays the theme of Mexico as a mestizo nation. In many of his murals, he paints scenes from Mexican history that show the multiple cultural sources that fed into Mexican heritage. This is one panel of a multi-paneled mural called The History of Mexico in the National Palace in Mexico City. Called The Aztec World, it shows the capital of Tenochtitlan and the emperor in the center, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god, flying in the sky, corn farmers off to the right, warriors fighting in the lower left, and also laborers, scribes, and other artisans. Here is the multi-paneled mural in flattened panoramic perspective. Each of the walls surrounding the grand staircase represents different epochs in Mexico's history. Here's another panel from the same mural. It is an homage to Mexico's workers, reflecting Rivera's own Marxist sensibility. Karl Marx takes prominence as the figure in the top center. Rivera, as did many others in his time, believed that the new government would ensure workers' rights, well-being, and security. The banner toward the right says huelga, meaning strike, reflecting the fact that Mexican workers at this time were forming unions to collectively promote their rights. In the bottom center, the woman in red is his wife, Frida Kahlo, also a painter. As we will see, they frequently depicted one another in their works. Rivera's renown led him to be invited to paint many murals abroad, such as this mural celebrating U.S. industrial workers in the Detroit Museum of Art. Rivera also expressed support for Mexico's peasantry in many of his works. This scene depicts the redistribution of lands that occurred in the 1930s as, following on the promises of the revolution, the president called for many of the largest land holdings as well as vacant lands to be redistributed to village communities. This was, in essence, the revival of the ejido system of land holdings secured for indigenous communities in the colonial period. In addition to his large public murals, Rivera also painted a series of smaller easel paintings, almost all of which celebrated the quiet dignity of Mexico's common people. In this one, a woman grinds corn using the mano and metate. In this one, The Day of the Flower, a flower seller carries a bundle of calla lilies on his back and holds prickly pear cactus leaves in his hand, leaves which are commonly eaten. The women in front are recognizable as indigenous women because of their braids and how the woman on the right carries her child in a shawl on her back. In another of his most famous paintings, a wave of calla lilies nearly envelops this indigenous woman. Although during their lifetimes, Diego Rivera was more famous than his wife, Frida Kahlo, today the opposite is true. Frida Kahlo was not a muralist, but an artist who created smaller oil paintings on an easel. She was influenced by the surrealistic style of the Mexican muralists, and she employed many of the same political themes. Her art was more personal, but still very political. It has been called proto-feminist, and many of her paintings celebrate the indigenous cultures. She was born in Coyoacán, just outside of Mexico City. Her mother was mestiza, and her father was a painter and photographer of German-Hungarian Jewish descent. Kahlo experienced a great deal of suffering in her life. She contracted polio at age 6 and survived a horrible trolley car accident at age 18. The accident broke many bones and an iron rod pierced her uterus. She had to undergo several surgeries, wear a painful brace, and was thereafter unable to have children, suffering several miscarriages. 1/3 of her paintings are self-portraits, often depicting her physical and or emotional pain. She was inspired by many elements of Mexican popular art, including the use of bright colors, the retablo style of painting, recalling that retablo paintings are those that express gratitude to a saint for a miracle performed, and indigenous themes. Unlike most women in middle-class urban neighborhoods at the time, she specifically chose to dress in traditional indigenous clothes. Here is one example of her work, a representation of her miscarriage when she and her husband were in Michigan when he was painting the mural in the Detroit Museum of Art. Note how bleak, cold, and sterile was her vision of industrial Michigan. Here she is on the US-Mexico border. Contrast the images of nature, life, fertility, and color on the Mexican side to, once again, a bleak, cold, industrial, mechanical, polluting United States. Here is a self-portrait in which she is dressed as a Tehuana. This type of headdress you may recall from the film Blossoms of Fire about indigenous women in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. This is another example of how she and her husband incorporated one another into their work. In this self-portrait, she painted her family tree, both her mother's mestiza side and her father's European side. Another example of the theme of physical pain. Notice her unibrow. She always painted herself with an exaggerated unibrow, which many have read as a feminist element of her work, an acceptance of her face as it was without editing out any elements that others might read as unfeminine. Another example of the theme of physical pain. Here is one example of how she borrowed the retablo style of painting. The inscription reads, "Here I, Frida Kahlo, painted myself using the image in a mirror. I am 37 years old and it is the month of July 1947, in Coyoacan, Mexico, where I was born." Note again the exaggerated unibrow as well as the light mustache. In this final image, Kahlo conveys a cosmovision, or vision of the universe. She depicts herself as essentially the mother of her husband, who had been known for displaying a fiery temper and for having affairs, but then begging forgiveness. She, in turn, is embraced by verdant, fertile Mother Earth, whom she identifies with Mexico, and they are, in turn, embraced by Mr. Xolotl, who in Aztec mythology was the god of lightning, who leads the dead to Mictlan, the underworld.